Google spent years studying what separated their best teams from everyone else. It turns out that skill and experience, it actually matters less than one specific condition that I think most church teams rarely name out loud. Hey, I'm Luke. Welcome back to the pod. As our team gets ready for SALT 2026 in Dallas this coming October, we're giving up our library access, opening the doors to 10 of our favorite workshops and sessions and community courses, dropping between each of the new episodes between now and conference. These are full sessions. These are unedited, and they are free, of course, to you on our podcast. This is training that I think you can use this week. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Andrew Johnston. He's a renowned leadership coach. He's worked with Apple, Walgreens, Salvation Army, and he has been a friend to the SALT community and SALT conference for well over a decade now. He builds this course on research behind that finding, and then he's going to apply it to what happens when something breaks on Sunday. We've all been there, right? If your culture treats failure as unacceptable, he's going to argue that you have already capped what your team can become. Listen, you can find leadership training anywhere now. But church-specific, ad-free, and vetted content is harder to find than ever. I know this course is going to be worth your time, whether you lead a staff or a room full of volunteers. So here it is today for you to benefit from. Dr. Andrew Johnston, take it away.
I go to a church who is proud of their slogans, proud of their values, and one of those is "Together is better." And they love this, so they say it often. They say, "Together is better," and they'll say it from the podium. "Together is better." They'll say it in meetings. "Together is better." But I'm an only child, and so I confess that every time they proudly proclaim "Together is better," there's a little part of me that just sort of thinks, really? Really? But of course, together has to be better, especially when you're putting together a creative team. Together has to be better because it's when we combine all those different talents, all those different ideas and points of view. Just when we add those hands and feet, we get a lot more product. We get a lot more creativity. We have those relationships that add resilience and encourage us. So I understand that together has to be better. But in my experience, together is almost always harder. It's a challenge to be a team, to create a group of people that's not just a mob, but comes together in sort of that magic way that lets them become even greater than the sum of their parts. The fancy word that we use for that sometimes is we use the term synergy, saying that when all those things are clicking, these differences aren't things that make us divergent or pull us apart. Instead, they become sort of a resource that we can mine to be even greater and more creative and more effective together. And it turns out that synergy is hard to come by, but everybody is looking for it. Everybody wants to know, how do I build a team that will create that kind of experience and that kind of output? Not surprisingly, Google was concerned about this. They were looking for the ingredients of what makes a really great team, because of course this would mean a lot to their success. If they could come up with the perfect recipe, they'd know how to assemble these high-performing teams from the start, and they wouldn't have to change the membership or retrain people or anything like that. So they put a lot of energy into this, and they started working on something they called Project Aristotle. They took up this question, what makes a great team, in true Google fashion. So they started crunching massive amounts of data. And all of the different teams that they had, they started putting information about what kinds of people were on this team, what kinds of talents they brought, what kind of attitudes they had, et cetera. Because obviously what they were looking for was the perfect recipe for a great team. And it turns out they were pretty disappointed. As they looked at that, they realized there wasn't any common ingredient. There wasn't any common type of person or type of member that was the sort of hallmark of a great team. But as they looked at it even more closely, they found a really rewarding answer. It wasn't so much the particular membership or the ingredients in a team that would predetermine whether it would be a high-performing team or not. It was actually all about what happened between those members in the team. The relationships, how they interacted together. Well, in my job, I work with all kinds of different teams in ministry and applications, creative teams, but I also work with them in the corporate world and in the military and in government. And everybody has the same question. How do I put a team together that's going to be this high-performing, synergistic team And we've learned now that we have to drill down at what happens among the members in the team. I put together a model for this that's called the 6 foundations of interdependence. But it turns out that those connections, that ability to depend on one another, is the real secret to synergy. It also turns out that we don't usually look at those things. We tend to look at the goal, which is to have that sort of team experience, and we focus on that like it's the finish line rather than on things that are closer to us, things that are more immediate. And it turns out that that goal of having synergy is really the happy consequence of some more immediate sorts of practices and priorities and commitments that you can see in this model. But today, with the time I have for you, I want to talk about one particular component of this model, one particular foundation of interdependence, and that is psychological safety. Psychological safety is a word that's bandied around a lot these days, and at its real roots, psychological safety refers to people's sense of comfort or confidence that they can share their real opinions, their real attitudes and ideas, that they can be real in a group without fear of shame or reprisals. In other words, they can give an idea without fear that somebody will just shoot it down disrespectfully, or they can talk about their real opinions without fearing that they'll be made to feel silly or ashamed for having them. It's really vital to the kind of connections that we need in a team to reap the benefits of this synergy. And what I've found is that psychological safety is really characterized in your team by how it responds to 2 things. The first of those is conflict, and the second is failure. I want to take just a couple minutes with you today to talk about how important it is that you shape how you respond to failure effectively to make people feel psychologically safe in your team. Because when people don't feel safe, well, they don't give their real opinions. It shuts people down and puts a lid on their candor and their contributions to one another. And some of the first casualties of this are innovation. Imagine how difficult it is for your team to be really creative and come up with new ideas if people are really fearing that what they put forth might be shot down or criticized unfairly. Another casualty is learning. Obviously, people don't learn unless they take some risks and step out in uncomfortable ways, and that doesn't happen if people are really afraid up front. And your quality of your collaboration starts to fall apart as well, because if people are afraid of failure, it makes it really difficult for them to be real and give their real selves to the sorts of relationships and interactions that you have. So it's vitally important in any team, but especially in a creative team, that you monitor how you deal with failure. It's not unusual for me to hear leaders sort of proudly declare when they take up a big project that failure is not an option. You probably heard this too. It's dramatic, it's sort of inspirational, but it's also a problem because, failure is always an option when you're trying to succeed on something important. In fact, I would even say if failure is not an option, it's virtually guaranteed because of the nature of success and failure in their relationship. We think of success and failure as opposites, right? So if I were to diagram that up here, I guess it would look something like this. This is the way we generally think of opposites, right? That they're at opposite ends of the continuum. But if you look at this for just a moment and consider some of the implications about this, you'll realize that this doesn't quite pan out in real life, because this way of thinking about success and failure suggests that we don't really have to pursue success in order to achieve it. Instead, we could just systematically and consistently avoid failure and find ourselves eventually backing our way into success. In other words, if I just saw opportunities to fail and I backed away from them, if I avoided them, and I did this every time it came up, every opportunity that I realized I could fail, if I moved away from it, I might eventually back my way into success. Well, think about it. Intuitively, we know that's not the way success and failure works. You can't just avoid failure and wind up successful, because playing not to lose is very different than playing to win. And so this isn't an accurate way of understanding success and failure. And if we think of it this way, we end up treating failure in ways that suboptimizes our team or hurts the psychological safety of our creative team members. So instead, we need to rethink this. And I would say that success and failure are opposites, but they're not opposites like this. They're more like opposites like heads and tails are opposites, the two sides of the same coin. In other words, They are opposites and can't ever be like flipped around and put together, but there is no time you can have one without having the other. Similarly, we have to adjust our thinking of success and failure to realize that failure belongs over here on the same end of the continuum with success. It's maybe this is the two sides of the same coin, but what it reminds us of is the fact that we can never pursue success without failure being an option. There's just no way to have one with the other. And if we want to go for success, we have to square our shoulders to the possibility, at least, of failure. This is a really important shift to make in your thinking if you want to improve the psychological safety of your team or ultimately build the synergy in your creative team, because it's being able to square their shoulders to failure and be able to not be put off by it or put down by it that allows them to step up and give themselves more fully to success and to one another. But when you look at this, I will admit there is something on the other end of the continuum. It's just a word that we may find honestly even a little more troubling than failure. And it's this: mediocrity. Mediocrity. Like, on one hand, we understand that success and failure are at the same side because we can't pursue one of them without the presence of the other. But think of it this way: if we go back to that sort of inclination we have to avoid failure, if we see it coming and we keep dodging it or stepping aside or making sure we're never in a situation to fail, well, now this describes what happens, because if we avoid it consistently, every chance we get, we don't wind up successful. We wind up safe but unremarkable. And if people on your team are really worried about failure, if they feel like it's the worst thing that can happen to them and it should be avoided at all costs, you're going to find that, well, not only are they not willing to step up and give themselves to one another in the process, but they're also not going to achieve anything particularly impressive. They're going to wind up in things that are safe but mediocre. One way of thinking about this is to realize that the atmosphere you want to cultivate in your team is a braver one than that. Because when people fear making bad choices or missteps and mistakes more than they fear being mediocre, you find that this shuts them down and they stop making choices and taking steps altogether. The second way that we can kind of bear out this new relationship with failure in ways that'll help psychological safety and the performance in creative teams is not just to realize that failure is always an option, but to go ahead and make friends with failure. Start talking about it in ways and demonstrating in ways that failure is part and parcel of the creative process, and that we don't fear it and we welcome it in. In fact, we manage it and talk about it and are aware of it in different ways. In one sense here, I was showing you that the relationship between success and failure are inseparable. Well, if you want to make friends with failure, you need to understand that it's the relationship between success and failure are also proportional. Now, when I say proportional, I mean that you can't pursue a success of any size unless you are willing to at least risk a failure of a similar size. When I use language like that, it may sound kind of strange because we don't have magic calipers that we can put on a success or a failure and measure their size. But I think just experientially, you know what I mean, right? There are some successes that you have in life, like a great conversation or maybe a closer parking place. And those things risk only very small failures, like, maybe a missed conversation or uncomfortable conversation or a longer walk to the store. And these kinds of failures maybe don't even register with you as a failure. You don't even feel a real sense of risk as you step into pursuit of those successes because it's easy to bounce back from these failures. They're no big deal, right? So a small success always tempts the prospect of a small failure. But, some successes in life, like, really big business deals or maybe a really important relationship of some kind, well, these are big deal successes, and correspondingly, they court the potential of big deal failures, like bankruptcies and breakups. This is a big deal success and this is a bona fide big deal failure. These kinds of big successes, when all goes well, get sort of tangled up with your identity in ways that sustain you and encourage you, and kind of you can live off that for a while, right? But correspondingly, the kind of failure you have to be prepared for is the kind of failure that will put a dent in you, that you can't just bounce right back from, the things that you have to take some time to recover from. And when you look at this, This is the sort of attitude you want to produce in your team, the sort of brave attitude that says, yeah, we want to pursue successes, but we have our eyes open and we are prepared for at least the prospect of a similarly sized failure. And my point isn't that you should just take as much risk as possible, go big or go home, go for the biggest successes of all. No, that would be irresponsible in some cases, because then you'd be courting failure that you're not prepared to risk. And my point is simply that this scenario doesn't exist. I think a lot of times we're looking to chase a big success, but we are not willing to risk a big failure. And this is a fiction that, if we're not careful, leads our people to be wary of failure and afraid of failures in ways that shut them down. So don't try to even invoke this image. Instead, invoke the idea that you're going to chase a big success and you're going to be prepared for a big failure. You're going to chase a small success and you're prepared for a small failure. Maybe one other thing to think about when you're thinking about the size of these things too is, I know that a lot of leaders and leading their creative teams come out of the gate chasing a really big success. Very soon after they start out for this, they realize that because it's a big success, that there is at least the prospect of a big failure. And this scares them because they realize that's a bigger failure than they're willing to risk. And so their next move is to go about trying to limit the size of that failure. It feels like they're being responsible. They start paring back on things to keep their team from being fearful or risking too much. But now that we understand that the relationship of success and failure are proportional, that even though they're focused at mitigating the prospect of failure, simultaneously they're scaling back on the size of the success they will reap in the end. This is why sometimes we come out of the gate really excited about really big ideas, really inspired about taking on something really huge. And when fear gets the better of us because we realize we're risking a big failure and we start constraining that, we do ultimately end up being successful, but the trophy we lift in the end is nowhere near as shiny as we thought it would be. It's not something that we find as fulfilling or as big an achievement as we'd hoped.
Together is better. It's easier to say out loud than it is to build, right? Well, Dr. Johnston's full course on the conditions that make it real, it's going to live within that SALT Community Library. Go to saltcommunity.com to get more information, and I encourage you to become a member today. As our team begins to finish all the preparations for SALT 2026, we've still got 9 more of these extra sessions that we're going to drop in between each of the new podcast episodes. So stay tuned for all the incredible content that's about to come your way. Also, if this impacted you or you feel like this is something your team needs to work through, feel free to send it to somebody and start walking through that curriculum together. This wraps this episode. I'll see you guys next time.